the FIRE free speech strand has been hugely important to us, because one of the things about, if you're Toby Young, or you're the Free Speech Union, or you're the Academy of Ideas and you're organising a festival like this, is we become preoccupied with the fight against censorship and the fight for free speech in the UK. But actually, this is, if you want, an internationally important issue, free speech. And at the moment, I think we can safely say that the international assaults on free speech require that there is solidarity way beyond the UK, and that we start to work together internationally. So as a collaboration, we have been delighted to work with an organisation which we at the Academy of Ideas hugely admire, which is FIRE, who've become, I think, the most preeminent principled free speech organisation in the US. Having said all of that, I disagree with them on the need for a First Amendment. So we thought that it would be, because you're allowed to disagree, right? Obviously, they're all about First Amendment rights in America, and you could say that what we need is First Amendment rights, or we need a First Amendment in the UK, and I disagree. So we thought we'd have a bit of a kind of bantery disagreement. I even think that we sometimes get completely obsessed with legal cases in the UK at the expense of the cultural argument for free speech. But that's another thing. The Free Speech Union do a huge amount of important legal work. I might well need them myself at any moment, so I don't want to fall out with them. But I worry that you can get tangled up in the law, and in a way, FIRE largely a legal protection using First Amendment. So that's sort of, we like to have a bit of dissent. So I'm going to now invite my speakers to give them 5 minutes each. Nico Perino is the Executive Vice President of FIRE, which is, for those of you who haven't picked it up yet, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. He's the creator and host of FIRE's So to Speak, the free speech podcast, which I think, in order to keep in touch with what's happening in the US and some of those debates, it's worth people signing up for and listening to. And Nico also co-directed and produced a documentary called Mighty Ira, which is a feature-length film about the life and career of ACLU Executive Director Ira Glass. And having talked to Nico earlier, a few months ago, we plan, post the Battle of Ideas, or certainly Alistair Donald and the Living Freedom team, plan to have a tour of that around UK universities, if not around Europe. But that's one of the things. So I can't begin to say how excited I am to have Nico here, because I've sort of talked to him, read him, listened to him, I even had a Zoom call with him, but now here he is in real life. We're then going to hear from Tom Slater, who I've just heard from because I was showing him in another session. He is the editor of Spike, the magazine that wants to change the world as well as report on it. He's a co-host of the Spike podcast and Last Orders podcast, who were performing live here at the Battle of Ideas. And I mean, everyone who will know Tom will know that he has completely enlivened Spike, made it an essential read, but he's also increasingly become an important writer for The Spectator. He's important commentator, and he's always consistent on free speech, and it's such an invaluable thing to have somebody as articulate and clever as Tom in your space. So I'm delighted to have Tom here. Thomas Walker-Worth is an associate editor of The Objective Standard, and the Objective Standard have actually been a great supporter of the Battle of Ideas over the last few years, so it's great to have Thomas with us. I'm calling him Thomas so that he's not Tom, so we don't all get confused. Thomas is currently writing his first full-length book, Reason for Living, A Rational Approach to Living Your Best Life, that hopefully will be out next year. And when it is, we can then discuss it at the Battle of Ideas with the Meet the Author sessions. That would be great. So good luck with getting that finished. And then finally, we've got Toby Young, who, to a UK audience, barely needs an introduction. He's the General Secretary of the Free Speech Union. The Free Speech Union has become the most important, I think, free speech, it is the most important free speech organisation. It's a union, and it defends people. I don't know where we'd be without it. And I mean, even like, it's like on social, every time I think I don't think the FSU don't know about this. I find that they've written an article and tweeted about it 2 hours before. I mean, they're everywhere. I don't even know how they do it, right? And then when I think, I better introduce them to this person, I find out they're giving them legal representation. I mean, it's a phenomenal thing to have done in such a short time, and they've done it largely because Toby has driven it. He's also the associate editor of The Spectator, where he writes a weekly column, and he also runs a blog called dailyskeptic.org, which has over 40 million page views, and that's got nothing to do with his free speech work. So he is a free speech hero on anyone's list. Can we just give all 4 of them? Oh God, 4 of them are welcome. This is a fast and furious session. Does the UK need a First Amendment? Answer, no. No, right. Nico.
Well, Claire, will it surprise you if I say it's complicated? So I want to begin with a story about what the First Amendment has meant in the United States. As most of those in this audience will know, it is the First Amendment to the United States Constitution that says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Now, for the first 140 years of American history, it might also surprise you that the Supreme Court of the United States never once struck down a government restriction on free speech under First Amendment grounds. 140 years, routinely anti-war protesters, labor activists, abolitionists were thrown in jail. Now, why did this happen? Part of it is your guys' fault here in England. We had to ask ourselves the question, what does the freedom of speech mean? And for most of American history, we took the Blackstonian approach, which was no prior restraints. So you could say whatever you want, but once you said it, we could throw you in jail, right? And indeed, 7 years after the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, the United States Congress passed the Sedition Act, which criminalized criticism of the president. Well, how did this manifest itself? Well, you have a gentleman named James Callender who was thrown in jail for calling John Adams, then the president, deranged. You have Franklin Bash, who was thrown in jail because he called Adams blind, bald, crippled, toothless, and querulous. So these are the early years of the First Amendment in the United States. Well, how did this change? That's the big question, right? Because that's not the First Amendment today. That's not the First Amendment that all of you know. It began with an organization called the Free Speech League that then transformed into the Civil Liberties Bureau. This is the early part of the 20th century. And that turned into an organization called the American Civil Liberties Union. These were campaigners for freedom of speech who did not like that early interpretation of the First Amendment. They had a broader interpretation of what the founders meant by freedom of speech. And they were able to enlist in the cause a Supreme Court justice named Oliver Wendell Holmes, who early in 1919 threw a bunch of socialists in jail for handing out anti-war leaflets opposing the draft. And then later in 1919, November, he changed his mind. This is called the Great Dissent in an Abrams case, where he dissented from the Supreme Court's throwing in jail other socialists in New York who handed out anti-war leaflets. What changed? Well, his friends got to him, and they made the argument for John Stuart Mill's approach to freedom of speech. This is the marketplace of ideas approach to freedom of speech. And over time, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes brought in another justice named Louis Brandeis, and the ACLU managed to expand the interpretation of what the First Amendment meant. Its first annual report was called The Fight for Free Speech. Its second annual report was A Year in the Fight for Free Speech. I have my own quarrels with how the ACLU has approached free speech in recent years. There were about 4 years in the 2010s where the free speech, those words were never once mentioned in any of its annual reports. But over time, the freedom of speech eventually grew in its protection, so much so that if you ask Americans today what their most precious right is, they'll say freedom of speech, even above religious liberty and the right to vote. I was recently reading a New York Times article where this chap, who you might know, I guess he's British, Matthew Goodwin, remarked that Americans have an almost religious-like commitment to free speech that is hard for foreigners to understand. And there are even some on the Supreme Court who say that the freedom of speech has become weaponized to strike down regulations that have nothing to do with speech. This is Justice Elena Kagan, who I happen to disagree with on that, but you get what I'm saying, right? Freedom of speech has evolved in America over time, and the First Amendment we know today was the result of a group of concerned citizens who didn't like anti-war protesters being thrown in jail, that didn't like labor organizers being thrown in jail. So laws and the Constitution is not enough. As Judge Learned Hand said in 1944, the spirit of liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, there's no Constitution, there's no law that can so much as save it. They have freedom of speech protections in the Constitution of Russia, China, and North Korea, but they mean nothing, just like they meant nothing in the United States of America for the first 140 years. So that's why the work of the Free Speech Union is so important. I think of you guys a little bit like the early ACLU, the Free Speech League, and the Civil Liberties Bureau. You can give new meaning to your free speech protections, just as we Americans did so as well.
Thank you very much. So I hate to admit it, Nico, but I quite like that, and I agree.
Oh, well, good.
And agree with quite a lot of it. I'm, by the way, the non-partisan chair. Tom.
Thanks, Claire. So does the UK need a First Amendment? I think it's clear to almost anyone that we can't go on like we have been. I know a lot of people were shocked by the censorious, authoritarian turn the government took in the summer in the wake of those despicable race riots, where we saw the Director of Public Prosecutions taking to the airwaves to say that even retweeting something hateful could land you in prison, when we saw government Twitter accounts foghorning the words "think before you post" and basically trying to put the wind up anyone who would dare utter dissenting thoughts. I think we saw in that particular moment very clearly that we're in this country, but not exclusively, lumbered with a ruling class who seem to see all of society's problems, be they racism or violent disorder, as basically downstream from an excess of freedom of speech. They genuinely seem to think, Keir Starmer genuinely seems to think, that if Elon Musk didn't let a handful of hard-right agitators back onto X 6 months ago, none of that stuff in the summer would ever have happened. That's a really very simplistic way of looking at things. I think it's also a very anti-human way of looking at things, but that, unfortunately, is how they look at it. And one of the things that I think is came abundantly clear in that moment is it was a reminder and an articulation, in a sense, of what the First Amendment is designed to do. It's to protect ordinary people's speech rights from moments of state authoritarianism or these kind of periodic flashes of official hysteria which take place from time to time. But I think that before we start talking about some kind of new constitutional settlement for the United Kingdom, really this is to put the cart before the horse. There's a prior problem that we need to address, which is precisely the culture of freedom of speech, the agitation towards securing our liberties, which needs to be sorted out first. There's a hell of a lot more work to be done. So the thing is, I think in the summer, that came as a shock to a lot of people, but really it shouldn't have been a surprise. I mean, the UK has been, it's almost the opposite story to what Nico was laying out there. We've been engaged in a long-running, decades-long experiment with policing hate and offence. It began in roughly 1965 with the Race Relations Act, but we've tumbled a fair way down the slippery slope since then. If you ask your average gender-critical feminist or even Christian street preacher, you no longer have to be some kind of far-right bigot to have your collar felt by the police these days. And it comes down to this problem, is that there is this culture amongst our ruling class which essentially sees censorship as all that stands between civilization and barbarism. What we really need to focus our efforts on is dislodging that ideology. And I think that if we want to push back against this censorship, as well as secure our rights in the long term, and we could discuss about the best way to do that, that is the prior thing that confronts us. Because, as Nico was laying out there, the First Amendment, first of all, has it not necessarily actually been protecting people's rights for most of its existence? It also didn't fall out of the sky. I mean, when the First Amendment was actually written, when it was debated, when that amendment was actually passed, it was the product, even then, of years of agitation amongst the American revolutionary generation, as they were agitating against British rule. They were under the yoke of Britain, they were subject to the various seditious libel laws, but they decided to defy them. They wrote pamphlets, they wrote broadsides, they burnt giant effigies of the king and the tax collectors and so on. And one of the fascinating things about this is even when these individuals were hauled up before courts for seditious libel and so on, jurors would refuse to convict them. Such was the strength of feeling for their rights and for their liberties at that particular point. So they seized freedom. It wasn't something that was handed down to them. Now, I'm not saying that we should all now go over to Parliament Square and burn a giant effigy of Keir Starmer.
No one is to clip this.
So that would be. What I am saying is that we should all focus on developing that culture of deepening the argument for freedom of speech, campaigning, persuading. I think a big part of it is seizing the moral high ground from these supposedly kindly censors who claim to wield this authoritarianism with the best of intentions. Otherwise, we haven't got a hope in hell of securing freedom of speech in the long term, overturning the rules that we have, let alone talking about some kind of longer term settlement for the future. And I think it's important to note, as Nico has already gestured to, is that even if you had a First Amendment in this country, that's not the way that you can secure it in the long term. You need that culture of agitation, you need that strident defence of freedom of speech from the bottom up if you're going to end up with a politics, with citizens who are willing to stand up for their rights and defend them even when they're being denied. And to kind of mirror the learned hand quote that Nico ended on, there's a very good one by George Orwell as well. It says, if large numbers of people are interested in freedom of speech, there will be freedom of speech, even if the law forbids it. But if public opinion is sluggish, inconvenient minorities will be persecuted even if laws exist to protect them. So I think that points to the main issue here. The prior thing that we have to confront is developing that firm culture of freedom. The appetite is there, I think. I thought it was striking the way many people responded to those clampdowns in the summer. People were really, even though they had no truck with the kind of opinions that were being expressed on social media and leading to people to be arrested, a lot more people than even I was expecting recognised that this was a huge problem for freedom of speech and for civil liberties. But I think the point now is to channel that into something that can push back against the censorship that we have and secure it for the long term as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you, that was excellent, Tom. Okay, Thomas.
So the First Amendment is different from anything we have in British law at the moment, and that's because it's part of the United States Constitution. And before we answer the question of whether or not we need a First Amendment in this country, we need to understand what the purpose of a constitution is to decide if we want to have a constitution in this country. And the proper function of a constitution is to define and limit the scope of government. Government is the organization that has a monopoly on the use of force in a given area. It's the organization that has the right to coerce you. And that very naturally has a lot of power. The proper function of a constitution is to limit that power, to define when it can and when it can't use that power. That's why we need constitutions, I think. What is the proper function of government? What is the function that the constitution should keep the government within? It's to create the conditions necessary for every individual, not just the majority, every single individual in a society to live fully as a human being, to use his or her own mind to choose values, choose goals, pursue those, achieve a flourishing life. And that requires removing force from society. It requires the government to protect you from anyone who wants to steal from you, rob you, defraud you, incite violence against you. Now, the government should not be a tool for the majority or for the political class or the aristocracy or anything like that to impose its particular views on individuals. It should just be protecting individual rights, the rights to life, liberty, and property, which includes the right to freedom of speech. Those are the rights that you need to live fully as a human being. You need the ability, the freedom to choose your values and pursue them. And that includes the right to speak your mind on your property or on somebody else's property with their consent. It does not include the right to somebody else's property or to somebody else's platform. Without a right to free speech, you can't choose your values, you can't discuss ideas, you can't debate values, you can't consider what is or is not the right set of morality, set of values, you can't even discuss what's true and false. So the function of a constitution is to keep, and indeed of the First Amendment, is to keep the government accountable to that proper function. Without it, by its nature, the government is free to use force willy-nilly against anyone as it sees fit. So essentially, a group of people, whether it's the largest number of people in an election, whether it's a powerful minority, can hijack that force and use it to impose their code of morality. Now, a constitution is different from regular law, like British common law, because it sits outside the normal legal process. It sits above the normal legal process. That makes it much harder for a group, whether they're numerically stronger or economically stronger or politically stronger, to undo that protection. And that's why I think we need a First Amendment. We need something that sits outside the ability of the majority to violate the rights of the minority. And it's also, to the point that Nico made earlier, it's why it needs to be worded very precisely and very objectively. It needs to be based on the actual requirements of human life, not on somebody's particular idea of what free speech constitutes, but on the actual necessary steps to protect individuals from the use of force against them and otherwise leave them free to live their lives as they see fit. The only alternative to a system like I'm describing, a constitutional system, is a system where anyone, the strongest, the most numerous, can hijack the government for their own purposes. Powerful people enforcing their ideas. That's exactly what we see in the realm of speech today. We see an in-clique in terms of ideas about gender, ideas about religion. We see a dominant culture. It's not, I don't think, numerically dominant necessarily, but a powerful culture imposing its edicts about the idea that you can't criticize religion, particularly Islam, about the idea that you can't say there are only two genders, all that kind of stuff. Discussion of principles, discussion of facts is being controlled and restricted, and a particular view is being put across by force. It's one thing if people put that view across privately, it's another thing if they use government force to do that. That prevents people from using their own minds to discover the truth about the world. One more thing I want to make very clear is that the requirements of human life are objective facts. They are facts you can understand by looking at human beings. It is a fact that we are individuals, that we live by the use of our own mind, that we create values and choose goals individually. These are objective things. You can see the evidence for them everywhere in human nature, in how we behave. Contrary to that, and by the way, I think the United States Constitution is not perfect, but it is largely based on those objective facts about human beings. British law is not. British law is very arbitrary. The common law system we have in this country basically means that whoever's in at the moment can just override previous legislation. We have a mismatch of 50 different people's ideas, or 50 different governments' ideas of what the proper way to do things is. We don't have a standard of objectivity. We don't have a constitution there to look back to and say, these are the facts, the principles we're going to govern our country by. Last thing I'll say is that some speech is disgusting, like Tom said. Some horrific stuff was being done. I mean, some genuine violence and force was being used, but in July. But speech itself is not a use of force. It's only a use of force if it represents a credible threat of violence. That's the only time the government should get involved. Otherwise, no matter how horrific, how appalling, we should privately chastise and sort of take our business away from people we disapprove of. We should not use government force to limit them. It is outside the proper role of government. And I think the need for a First Amendment is to keep the government within that proper role.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think actually broadening that out into the constitutional question is very helpful to just take a look back on that and think about it. Okay, so thank you. Toby.
Thank you. I wanted to begin by taking issue with the idea that we need a British version of the First Amendment on the grounds that the First Amendment is actually just an American version of the English common law breach of the peace principle. And that's clear if you look at some of the First Amendment jurisprudence, such as Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969, which established the Brandenburg test, which says the First Amendment doesn't permit a state to prescribe speech, even a speech advocating the use of force or the violation of a law, unless it's directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action. Imminent lawless action, that's American for breach of the peace. And it shouldn't be a surprise that the First Amendment is an American translation of an English common law principle, since the first 10 amendments of the US Constitution are, broadly speaking, an attempt to incorporate the best of English common law, including the right to bear arms, into the American Constitution. So the question is, how can we best restore the common law breach of the peace principle? A British version of the First Amendment, as Tom says, as Nico has said, would certainly be preferable. It would be an improvement on where we are now. But is it the best solution to the problem? And I think not. I agree with Claire for a number of reasons. First of all, it would be a departure from the English common law principle that unless something is explicitly prohibited by law, it's permitted. That principle, as you can understand, is a great guarantor of our liberties. Unless it's explicitly prohibited by law, it's permitted. The First Amendment, to me, sounds more like it's in keeping with the Napoleonic Code, which is the opposite principle. Unless something is explicitly permitted, then it's prohibited. It would effectively be explicitly permitting speech. And I don't think we want to grant the state the right to permit us to have something we're born with and should have by natural right. Second, unlike in America, where, a point that Thomas made, where amending the Constitution is indeed a cumbersome process, and that means the First Amendment can be given a kind of status beyond the day-to-day battles of politics and a kind of longevity. We don't have that here. We have the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. So even if we did pass a law incorporating a British version of the First Amendment into British law, it could simply be repealed by a successor parliament, which isn't much of a guarantee of free speech. Third, I think, and probably most importantly, it would require us to place our faith in the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom as the ultimate custodians of free speech, and I'm just not very confident they do a good job. Frankly, I don't trust the upper echelons of our judiciary to discharge that duty. And judging from the capture of the lower echelons by radical progressive ideology, which sets very little store by free speech, I think things will only get worse over the next couple of decades. Do you really want to place the sacred trust of protecting our free speech to a group of judges pickled in gender identity ideology and critical race theory? Who's to say that Judge Melbourne Inman, who last week sentenced Lucy Connolly to 31 months in jail for an offensive tweet, won't ascend to the Supreme Court one day? Would you trust him to protect our free speech? One safeguard against the risk of bad justices who don't really care about free speech being appointed to the Supreme Court in the US is that they are appointed by the president and they enjoy life tenure, more or less. Here, Supreme Court justices are appointed by unelected officials, i.e. the blob. You might think that a British First Amendment could be so worded as to protect us from mischievous, woke Supreme Court justices who didn't care very much about free speech. But even if the wording was identical to the wording of the US First Amendment, and of course it would be bound to be a far more diluted version of it. But even if it was identical, that would be an inadequate safeguard against woke justices on the Supreme Court, because as Nico pointed out in his opening remarks, the First Amendment failed to protect free speech for 140 years after the First Amendment was made. And he gave various examples. I could give some more, but I don't think that's in debate. The First Amendment was only successful in protecting free speech in the 20th century and to a certain extent in the 21st century, thanks to right-minded Supreme Court justices being appointed to the court. So I think if we were to pass a British First Amendment, we would ultimately be at the mercy of our Supreme Court justices, just as the Americans are, and frankly, I don't trust them, particularly given how they're appointed. So what's the alternative? The answer, I think, is a great free speech repeal act, repealing all the laws that have restricted free speech, dating back, I think, to at least the 1965 Race Relations Act. There's your headline, by the way, if there are any undercover journalists here. Speaker at far-right conference says the rot started with the Race Relations Act. We have to strip away all these weeds to reveal the beautiful garden that is English common law. And what about the problem that Thomas has drawn attention to, that successor parliaments could, of course, reinstate those laws? Well, they could reinstate them. They could bring back legislation to bring back all those weeds, covering up the beautiful garden that is English common law. But that would require multiple acts of parliament instead of just the one it would take to repeal the British First Amendment. So let's not make it easy for them. Let's just repeal all those restrictions rather than introduce a law that could be repealed in one go by the next parliament. Thank you.
Right, now, very good. Now, you know the format, but I'm actually going to change it a bit, which is that, I'm going out to the audience, but you're going to kind of just do quick, sharp, and I'm going to kind of take 3 at a time, come back up for quick, sharp responses, back out, right? So it's not like long philosophical thoughts. No disrespect to you. Right, that gentleman there.
Yeah, Jared Hosier. Should we be careful for what we wish for? Because when the American Constitution was
Ratified?
Written, it was basically pushback against the monarchy. You know, the free speech was partly against the monarchy. But if we had a constitution that gave us free speech, inevitably, today they would write in all kinds of exceptions. It would be guaranteed that there will be exceptions. You guys did it when you were very naive and you didn't put in any clauses against it. We will have 100. That's those same 100.
Thank you very much. Now, the microphone is with someone. Stand up and speak. Yeah. Thank you. That person there, then you, then I'll come to the audience, panel. Yeah.
I wondered if you had a nice succinct list of those laws. You mentioned the Race Relations Act. I mean, the Malicious Communications Act, is that one of them? If you insult someone in a text message, that can get you arrested. A nice succinct list. We can then give that to political parties to have in their manifesto to repeal, please.
Yes, thank you. I was thinking that just the same, even though I've done this sort of thing myself, that's a great thing that could be popularised, but as an aside. Yes, whoever's got the microphone, yes.
Yeah. John Benjamin. Just another argument not often made against having this type of clause in the UK law is there's already an international panoply of legal guarantees for free speech, which we don't quote often enough, and it's unambiguous. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights within the UN context led to the Civil and Political Rights Treaty, which the US ratified, and it refuses to ratify many international treaties because of the supremacy of the US Constitution, but it ratified this one, which says everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers. And additionally, in the UK context, of course, the ECHR is currently very controversial in a migration context, but it's not controversial in this context. Unambiguously, we are a member of this treaty. It says everyone has the right to freedom of expression. No ifs, no buts. We should quote these international commitments much more frequently.
Thank you, that was very useful. Right, that gentleman there is the one I agreed to have, and then we'll start back with Timandra after I've taken the panel, but yes.
Hi there, my question is specifically for Toby and Tom. It's not so much the laws that we know about that are problematic in of themselves, it's also just a general policy creep. So the Royal College of Policing, for example, they have training on legal but harmful speech and how to sort of check people's thinking. You know, that's something which is entirely new. It's only the past couple of years. Real ways to tackle that, like you were speaking about, would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Just rushing across the panel. Nico, anything to say?
Yeah, quickly, on the Constitution, it's fundamentally an anti-democratic document that is necessary also for democracy. So, as Thomas was saying over there, if there is one person who has an opinion and the rest of the United States of America wanted to censor that person, the Constitution prohibits it. There's no majority that can censor your rights. And the First Amendment is, contra Toby, grounded in natural rights. I think that's very clear from the founding. But freedom of speech is also necessary for the democratic process, right? We use our words to solve our disputes. We don't use guns and we don't use violence. But if words are considered violence, as is often discussed today, then the whole ballgame is gone. Then you're justified in using violence against words. So we also have the 9th Amendment to our Constitution, which, like your common law tradition, says those powers not expressly granted to the federal government are reserved for the people. So we have some of the same traditions that you all have as well, but we did start from a place with the United States Constitution where once those rights have become enshrined, they are very hard to take away. You would need 2/3 of each house of Congress in order to propose an amendment to the United States Constitution, and then you would need 3/4 of the states to ratify that amendment. So it's very hard, and there has been efforts, for example, to pass a Constitution amendment to the United States, to the First Amendment, for example, with regard to flag burning. It failed by one vote. One vote. And I think one of the great things about America is that you can express your hatred for America, you can express your freedom by burning its flag.
Great, thanks. Toby.
Caveats and qualifications, good point, and I think that strengthens my argument. I think it's very difficult to write a guarantee of free speech into law, which isn't in some way qualified. It's never an absolute right. It's not an absolute right in the European Convention on Human Rights. And that means there's always room for judicial interpretation, which means we have to be able to trust the Supreme Court justices and I don't. List of laws that need to be repealed, good idea. A project we should get going with. If you'd like to make a donation to the Free Speech Union so we can employ someone to do that work, I'd be absolutely delighted. John, you make a really good argument, I think. I think the problem with Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights is that it is a little too qualified, and appealing to the Convention to get legislation, domestic legislation, overturned because it supposedly breaches it is extremely difficult. The Free Speech Union tried to get the conviction of someone under the Malicious Communications Act overturned. This was in Scotland, and we weren't given permission by the European Court to proceed. We've been thinking about whether we could challenge the Scottish Hate Crime and Public Order Act under the European Convention on Human Rights on the grounds that it's a breach of Article 10. But that's certainly not clear-cut, and a case which we think is attractive has yet to come along, and even if it did, we probably wouldn't be granted permission by the court to proceed. Legal but harmful, really good point. The Free Speech Union and others made a really concerted effort to get that phrase stripped out of the Online Safety Act. We succeeded. I hate that phrase because it creates a grey area. It's a breach of that English common law principle that something should be permitted unless it's explicitly prohibited. It creates a kind of grey area in which something is legally permitted but somehow prohibited anyway. We did manage to get it stripped out of the Online Safety Act. I very much worry that this government's going to put it back in.
Thank you, Toby. The worst thing about that legal but harmful is they've got this new one which is lawful but awful. So they might not bring that in, but they've started using this phrase a lot. I mean, it's a terrible phrase, isn't it? Lawful but awful. Anyway, so watch out for that. Right, Thomas.
I'll limit myself to 2 points for the sake of time. First, I think one of the two really big problems with the United States Declaration of Independence and Constitution is the phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident, because it turned out that other people didn't. And the argument for the rights to life, liberty, and property was not made well enough at that time. It wouldn't be made well enough for about another 200 years. It has been more recently, and I haven't got time to talk about it now, but I hinted at it earlier, which is that it needs to be grounded in human nature, in the nature of human beings as individuals who live by the use of their own individual minds. It must be objective in that sense. The US Constitution is close to that. The UN Declaration of Human Rights is not at all. It's quite similar in some respects to the Weimar Republic's constitution that remained in effect after Hitler came to power because it was completely useless at protecting freedoms. So it must be objective, not majoritarian, not democratic. Sorry, I know that's like everyone's favorite concept, but no. It should protect every individual, not uphold the will of the majority. The other thing I want to say is I absolutely agree with Toby that the British tradition of everything's allowed unless it's said not is better than the European tradition of just permitting certain ways of doing things. The proper function of a constitution, like the US Constitution, is not to grant freedoms, it's to limit the government. I think that's really important. It's a restriction on the people in power, not a granting of freedoms to regular people. They have all the freedoms besides what the government's allowed to restrict them from doing.
Thank you very much. That was helpful. Tom.
Yeah, I think the point down here was very well made. If we were to task this generation of politicians, great legal minds, to craft a new constitution for the United Kingdom, God knows what they would put into it. I mean, they're more likely to enshrine a right not to be offended than a right to freedom of speech. I think we all know that is clear. My point, whatever route you want to take, whether you want to a great restoration, as Toby sees it, whether you want a new constitutional settlement for the United Kingdom, the thing we have to sort out first is that culture of freedom of speech. Without one, the other one doesn't exist. And I think it's also one that we can really draw on our own history of the agitation against censorship, of our own history of our agitation against authoritarianism, not least because that's part of what produced the First Amendment in the first place. I mean, a lot of the people who are, as I say, the revolutionary generation were inspired by English radicals as well, people like John Wilkes, the great politician, publisher, journalist, and occasional pornographer, who was sent to the Tower for criticising the king and for making various jokes about what the king's mother might have been getting up to. So that was someone who really inspired that revolutionary generation. He was arrested because of the 45th edition of his newspaper, and the number 45 was central to the struggle in America, not only for their independence, but also for freedom of speech. Just very, very quickly on this sort of democratic point, I think to set freedom of speech against democracy as if these two things are naturally antagonistic, it really isn't it, not least because it is through democracy broadly defined, not only people voting and participating in that sense, but also involved in activism, involved in protest and so on. which is how people can enshrine and protect their rights. And I think that's a particularly important point to stress today, which is we don't really have a democratic majority suppressing the views of the minority necessarily. We've often got an elite suppressing the views of the majority, if you look at the kind of things that people are being arrested for. Because as I said earlier, you don't have to be some kind of far-right lunatic to have your collar felt by the police these days, even just happening to believe that there are two sexes and you should use pronouns that accord with that, have led to various arrests, not convictions or some that have been overturned, but nevertheless it shows the kind of direction that we're headed. So I think to set free speech against democracy misses the point, but the general point is that we need to seize freedom rather than just expect it to be handed down by the great and good, as it were.
Okay, thank you. So I've got Timandra, that gentleman there, that lady there, yeah.
Well, actually, I mean, my point follows on very well from what Tom was just saying, because when I was looking back at the origin of the First Amendment for my book, which is still on sale, and I'm afraid I can't remember the exact wording here, people on the panel probably can, but I remember being struck that it wasn't originally really about individual freedom to express what an individual thinks. It was very much couched in terms of the people, and I think it was not abridging the freedom of speech, of assembly, and of the press, because, and one of the early drafts acknowledged that without freedom of the press and of assembly, then the people could not express their democratic rights. And I think it really helps to make that point now, because freedom of speech is often expressed as, well, why should this individual have the freedom to say whatever they like when I don't want to have to hear it, or when some other person might hear it and have an ill effect? It's not about an individual's right to express their feelings. It's about you cannot have a democracy without the right of the freedom of speech and assembly and the press in order that we can have this democratic debate.
Okay, thank you. Very helpful. So that lady there, then I'll move along, yeah? And then Jan, and then, yeah.
Could you just speak on the role of social media, particularly when it comes to being policed on thought, on speech? It sort of makes it permanent, makes it very public. But also whether you think the fact that these companies are American means we indirectly benefit from that First Amendment, whether we're fortunate they are American companies or if they could only exist in America, and how we make sure that we don't then fall victim to other governments interfering in a public platform that we all use, or even individuals if they are privately owned now.
Okay, very interesting question. I don't know if we're going to have time to go into it in detail, panel, but do comment. But you should then talk to Timandra over the drinks and also get them. Yes.
Thank you. Robert Craig. I teach constitutional law at Bristol University, so the idea that there's no constitution leaves me out of a job. So we do have a constitution. It's based on, fundamentally, as Toby was saying, on the idea of a political constitution, which is based on Dicey's ideas, not on legal regulations and legal protections, which, as he says, are ephemeral and can be removed at the stroke of a pen, which was Dicey's criticism of the French Revolution, because they kept changing the constitution. So the idea that we have legal protections is nonsense. On echo Tom Slater's point, which is excellent, I didn't know that Orwell quotation, I'm going to use it, it's fantastic. If you have legal protections but you don't have the political culture, you're doomed. It's just not going to work. And the final thing I want to say is the ECHR, subsection 10.2, 10 is freedom of expression. 10 subsection 2 is the exercise of freedoms may be subject to formalities in protect public safety, prevention of disorder or crime, protection of health or morals, protection of the reputation or rights of others, and preventing. It's an absolute coach and horses. This doesn't protect anything. Political culture is what protects us. That's the only thing that protects us. It's things like this will protect us, not the law.
Thank you. Very helpful. Jan Varish. Two at the back.
I'm going to disagree with Tom in this session, having agreed with him in the previous one. I think there's a slightly false distinction here between law and culture, and this idea that you change culture first and then you change law, because the suffragists didn't do that. They didn't say, well, if only we could change society and the way it thinks about women, and somehow society will kind of encourage society to see us as equal, and then we'll go for the vote. They used the campaign for the vote to change the way in which society sees women. So I kind of think that actually campaigning around law is actually a very, very productive thing to do, as long as you don't think that tinkering with the law away from the people somehow solves the problem. But I think law is a really, really good focus for campaigning, which has a transformative effect on people's perception of democracy and the democratic rights.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I'm going to take one more, then I'm starting. Right, hand there, stand up, hand there. Yes, that's it, thank you. He knew what I meant. Right, It's always good.
Thank you. I'm going to say this as an atheist, at the least an agnostic, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the First Amendment was a God-given right, and so the idea of a natural right obviously came from a period when religion was much more influential in effectively the setting up of a new state, new country. Obviously, I'm not advocating that we get the big guy involved again, but if we are going back to a position where we're electing in inverted commas, somebody to impose some sort of natural right that's above the ability of politicians or any lawmakers to contravene it, then obviously I wouldn't want to give away our secular state status to do that. So it's a real problem.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to come back to panel, but I've still got time, yeah? Bizarrely, because we've been speedy. So I'm going to come back to the panel, then I'm going to go out. So the people with the microphones, if you can give them to people who are at the back who've been kind of waving their hands around, that would be useful. Right, starting this time. Tom.
Yeah, no, the point about campaigns around law can be very important to that kind of process of changing the culture. I do actually agree. I think the two just have to go together. There's a kind of idea that, particularly if we're talking about changing the entire constitution, which would be different from changing a law if you're talking about it in the kind of American sense of it hovering over the way in which business is done. I think there's just a lot more work to do. But I think we should talk about, as we already have in the room a little bit, some campaigns that we should get around. One of which has already been raised is the prohibition on quote-unquote grossly offensive speech in the Communications Act, which from my rough understanding seems to account for an enormous amount of the speech convictions which currently exist. There was that Time survey back in 2017 which found that 9 people a day were being arrested for saying grossly offensive things on the internet. And as Nico's colleague, his boss in fact from Fire, Greg Lukianoff, pointed out, that means that the UK is currently locking up more people than America did during the first Red Scare, which, if nothing is going to kind of make us realise that this is a battle that needs to be fought, that should. So yes, let's unite around particular campaigns. I guess my point is we can never neglect that kind of broader culture, which is what is often missing from some of these discussions, I suppose.
Thank you. Thomas.
I'll be as quick as I can. So very much agree with the point that cultural change needs to come before political change. The suffragettes, the civil rights movements, those things were able to happen because there had been a cultural change, because people started to believe more in individual rights and equality. My main mission in all the work I do is to advocate the idea that we need to move towards a culture that's more rational, more based on reason, more based on individual people using their own minds and thinking critically, thinking individually. And our education system and culture do not encourage that at the moment. That's the bigger problem. Very quickly on democracy, I think the word is used as a package deal. It's 2 different concepts blended into one, and one thing I'd like to change is for people to be more precise about language. Democracy can mean voting for your leaders. I thoroughly support that. It can mean the majority having its way. I do not support that. I think we need to divide those concepts into 2 different things. Lastly, to Tamandra's point, I'll just say that only individuals have goals, values, feelings. Society does not, democracy does not. Those things are values to the extent that they serve individual people, not the other way around. Individual people are not a means to the ends of society. Society is a means to the end of individual people. The individual human being is the only source of value. We create values, we give things value. Human beings, rational minds, if there are any others that aren't human, have to be the beginning of any rational, moral and legal system.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Toby.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question as to whether culture is downstream from law or law downstream from culture. Clearly, it's a kind of chicken and egg question. But it came up actually when the Free Speech Union were advocating for the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. One of the arguments against passing legislation to try and strengthen the protections for academic freedom and free speech in universities was that, well, it's downstream of culture. Just embedding these protections in law, creating some complaints mechanisms to make sure they're observed more often, that won't make any difference. It's the culture you've got to change. To which our response was, well, look at the Equality Act. That has transformed the culture of workplaces, of public institutions, of public life since it was passed in 2010. So I agree with Jan. I think changing the law can have a profound effect on the culture, even if certain cultural antecedents are necessary. I think with the question about how to resolve this problem, that Parliament is sovereign, so whatever changes we make to the law to better protect free speech, they could be just repealed by the next Parliament. I think you have to design the law and make the case in such a way that it's very, very politically difficult for a successive government to reverse it. And we saw Gordon Brown's Labour Party do that quite successfully with the Equality Act. Wasn't even amended in 14 years of supposedly conservative government, and we see it as well with the Human Rights Act. I think Robert Jenrick is going to have his work cut out if he does win the Conservative leadership election and wants to make repeal of the Human Rights Act a flagship policy of the next Conservative manifesto. I think it's just politically very, very hard to repeal something called the Human Rights Act. So we have to think about, and you're right, chap at the back, it may be that we have to think of another way of grounding the argument for free speech, which doesn't depend upon a Christian framework, given how few practicing Christians there are. It has to have more resonance, more universal appeal than that. It has to be able to defend itself in an entirely secular world.
Thanks. Nico.
I want to thank Tamandra for prompting me to do something that I should have done at the beginning, which is tell you all what the First Amendment actually says, right? We're making reference to its free speech clause, but it protects 5 or 6 rights, depending on whether you think the free exercise and establishment rights are separate rights. Nevertheless, it says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging freedom of the speech or of press or of the right to peacefully assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances. 46 words, 5 or 6 rights, depending on how you shake it. So the free press and the free assembly stuff is in the First Amendment and has always been in the First Amendment. I think the interesting thing about the history of the First Amendment is that the documentation about the debate surrounding it is pretty thin. So when people are trying to interpret it, what they'll often look to is the Virginia Declaration of Rights. This is the state in which James Madison, the drafter of the Bill of Rights, and Thomas Jefferson came from. And one of the things that's interesting about the Virginia Declaration of Rights is that there is some documentation about the debate surrounding free speech there. And there was a big debate whether you call it the freedom of speech or toleration of free speech. They're 2 different things. And James Madison made the muscular and forceful argument that no, you have the freedom to do something. We don't merely tolerate that freedom. And that's how it arrives in the First Amendment. I want to make one interesting point that I guess is kind of responsive to Thomas, because I'm sensing a bit of Ayn Rand's objectivism from what you're saying.
Oh, yes.
Which I can appreciate. And I recently had some objectivists from the Ayn Rand Institute on my podcast, and they hate John Stuart Mill. They hate him. And free speech advocates will often refer to John Stuart Mill in his seminal 1859 treatise on liberty as the seminal articulation of what free speech means. And it's largely what our Supreme Court has adopted. But John Stuart Mill didn't believe in natural rights. This came from a utilitarian perspective, his argument for free speech, a practical expector, the most good for the most people. And so you do see some censors across the world referring to John Stuart Mill to justify their censorship by referring to the harm principle that he articulated. That's what you get in Brazil, for example, with this justice who's trying to ban X in that country, saying, I'm just referring to John Stuart Mill because what these people are saying on X is harmful. So I think John Stuart Mill is great in that he articulates a practical reason why you should have free speech, the marketplace for truth, for example, but I think you can't do it without also the natural rights grounding, which comes from the United States Constitution and some of the framing surrounding it.
I think that those answers indicate for anyone who thinks it's sufficient to just wander around and say, I'm a free speecher, to win an argument, that it's more complicated and we have to get better,
Sure, yes.
and the subtleties of this. I mean, even in relation to the free speech, because Toby's absolutely right that there was nervousness. I was one of the people who was nervous, actually, that if you hadn't won the cultural arguments around free speech on campus, that just having this bill would, become a kind of easy sop. Everyone would nod it through. Although I argued for it because I was convinced it was worth it. But the thing that was really frustrating, and it was really frustrating, because the people who were against the higher education free speech bill basically said, oh, you're plaguing legalistic ways, and what about the culture of free speech? I mean, these people wouldn't recognise the culture of free speech if they fell over it, right? But the problem then we had was, I then went along and argued for the bill, the new government tear it up, and there isn't an outcry in society because we haven't got a culture of free speech or respect for academic freedom. I mean, there's an outrage amongst those of us who were campaigning for it, but it hasn't. You can say it to people and they go, yeah, wasn't that the hate speech charter that was going to damn it? You know, and it's like, oh, for God's sake. So it just shows you we've got our work cut out. That's the point I'm making. I'm not being complacent at all. Anyone else then? Right, one last round of questions. So that gentleman, right, so yes, that gentleman there and then there. Oh yeah, there's two. And then right at the back, yeah?
Hi, very, very quick one. Just because the Human Rights Act and ECHR has been mentioned a few times, and there's been a lot of debate over whether to repeal it altogether or keep it, and it seems to be quite black and white. Is there a derogation in which you can repeal part of it, or the bits that you don't like? I think in the ECHR Articles 15 and 16, but I think it may only be temporary. I just thought, I don't know if there are any constitutional law experts there, but I just thought I'd ask that.
Yeah. That gentleman, constitutional lawyer, will talk to you afterwards over a beer. Right, there's two people there. There. You and then the person behind you, and then there's a couple at the back, then the final panel for some more. Yeah, for final remarks.
Hi, I'm Abhishek Sahaf.
Oh, hello.
So Nico mentioned about First Amendment jurisprudence really coming into its own in the 20th century, and we heard about Brandenburg versus Ohio, which I think is a crown jewel of First Amendment. But and it was indeed free speech culture that produced the Supreme Court judges and the ACLU that pushed for this. But what has not been mentioned, perhaps, is that I think on every survey done in the last 100 years, the US public has consistently favored far more speech restrictions than what is under the US Supreme Court, what is allowed, often by huge margins. There is pervasive misinformation about what the US Supreme Court has said. People think there is a hate speech exception to the First Amendment, including the vice presidential candidate from the Democratic Party. So the point I'm trying to make is that what really has made it work, it seems to me, is the US system, the separation of powers and constitutional supremacy. So how can we do that in the UK is completely unclear, where we have parliamentary sovereignty. So Toby mentioned repealing every act for the last 40 years. That's probably not realistic. We could repeal a few, the grossly offensive, the malicious communication, and so on. So I was wondering, what would the panel think about taking an act, which every other act has to be interpreted, namely the Human Rights Act, every act has to be interpreted compatibly with the Human Rights Act, and just scrapping 10.2 of it, which has a bunch of exceptions. That might be one possibility.
Thank you very much. Okay, so there's a little bundle of people at the back who want to speak, and then we'll finish off. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. Okay. It strikes me that a lot of the things that are being said by the panel are we need to create a culture of free speech, and if we need to do that, then surely we need to start at the beginning in schools. And so I personally think that one of the things that's missing in schools is the ability to, the encouragement of children to learn the art of debating, and I don't mean old-fashioned debating, just the ability to express views that are oppositional in a way without abuse or whatever, and I think that that's completely lacking from education. So that would be my suggestion for how to grow the next generation into loving and using free speech. What would the panel's suggestions be for how we can get the next generation to enjoy free speech?
Thank you very much. I've forgotten that person there behind who I said could speak. So whoever's got the microphone, speak now. But there's somebody here behind Abhishek, yeah?
Yeah, I've got just two good faith objections that I'm interested in what the panel think. One is about the line for incitement to violence, which I think is in the US Constitution. And let's say if there was a Islamist terror attack and some people said online, we should continue to, set bombs off, for example. Because obviously during the riots, some people have been jailed in the context of a, spontaneous, real threat of violence, said things to the nature of, I don't care if, blow them up for all I care, with people in it. So a lot of free speech activists have obviously said that should never have happened, the fact that this person was and other people charged. How are we defining incitement to violence in that instance? That's my first question. And then my second one is it censorship if people choose to leave Twitter? So what I mean by that is, since Elon Musk took over, I have seen a huge increase in anti-black and anti-Semitic racism. I mean, many of my Jewish friends, if they say anything mildly supportive of Israel, they'll be flooded with the most horrific neo-Nazi content. I've experienced it myself, that if I say anything even mildly pro-immigration, I'll be flooded with just the most horrific anti-black racism, comparing black people to animals and all sorts of things. If I said, well, actually, I don't really want to be on this platform because I think this is just not a very nice place to be, and then I went for a platform that perhaps had a bit of content moderation, but still was an open space, is that me not supporting a culture of free speech? What is the line between, I guess, bigotry and harassment is perhaps also the question.
Very good questions as well. Right, so this person here, stand up so that they can see. Yeah. And is there anyone else, finally, who hasn't spoken before, who wants to speak? Or are we done?
There's one.
Right, 1, 2. Right, that's it. We're done.
If you want to encourage a culture of debate in schools, you can promote Philosophy for Children, which is run by Saperi, and some schools do a really good job of fostering that.
Very to the point. Right, who's got the microphone? You have, yeah.
Thank you. My name is William from 104 London Debaters, where we very much celebrate freedom of speech, as you know, Claire. My question is, in our efforts to protect freedom of speech, I have noticed sometimes a tendency to want to use the power of the state to sort of impose on private organizations, whether it's social media or other companies or so forth, an obligation to give people a platform or to accept their views. Isn't it the right in a free society to actually, if you're a private organization or company, to censor those you want to censor? Because, you also have your right of freedom of expression.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's just, where are you? Yes, sorry. And here, please. Thanks. Cheers.
Very quickly, if we had a constitution, likely we would have other rights that people would want to stuff into this new constitution. One of the main opponents of freedom of speech is there's the right to privacy. It's Article 8 in the ECHR. And would we not just simply have the same clash of rights that we have now?
Yes, good question. I'm going to take the panel in reverse order, and I've got a minute and a half each, something. Just on the young people, I just wanted to say that one of the things that the Ideas Matters charity does, associated with the Academy of Ideas, runs Debating Matters. It's for 16 to 18-year-olds, but you don't have to kind of go in and tell everyone about free speech. You can demonstrate it by showing why debating matters and showing there's two sides to an argument, at least, actually, and dig a bit deeper and so on. And that's one of the things that, as a debaters organisation that you were just talking about. So there's lots of ways I do think that young people could be introduced to these concepts. But the other thing I just wanted to note was that in the House of Lords, I spend a lot of time being lectured to by human rights lawyers and international people lecturing about international law and the United Nations, the importance of United Nations charters and so on and so forth. And it drives me mad. During the online safety bill discussions, I quoted the UN Charter in relation to free speech. And everyone looked at their shoes, looked out the window, in other words, they didn't care, right? So it's like the stones sent down from God, one day, right? Until it's on free speech, and then they go, oh, so what's that? I mean, they're looking at, right, literally. So that's a thing that we have to think. I think that's what's been very helpful about this discussion, the difference between the US and the UK, but also there's no magic way to win this. There's no easy way to win this. We've all got a lot of work to do, in other words. Okay, starting in the reverse order then. Tom. Is that right? Reverse order? No, I've got that wrong. Oh, God.
Who was last?
Toby.
Okay.
Sorry, Toby.
I think gentleman makes a good point about maybe the answer is not to repeal the Human Rights Act in its entirety, but derogate from certain articles of the European Convention on Human Rights, like Article 3, and you can see other European countries weighing in behind a campaign to derogate from that article. Italy just fell foul of it in trying to deport illegal migrants. One way to strengthen the culture of free speech in schools, I don't think, is to guarantee the free speech of children. I think that way lies chaos, obviously. But I think free speech could be added to the British values that schools are expected to promote. When I made that argument to the Department for Education a few years ago, they said, no, that's already there in the British value of promoting respect and tolerance for different religions and beliefs. In fact, when the head teacher at Batley Grammar School was when the head teacher suspended the RE teacher at Batley Grammar for showing children a picture of a cartoon of Mohammed from the Charlie Hebdo, he said, I'm invoking that principle, that British principle, that value I'm supposed to promote. He didn't promote mutual respect and tolerance of the faith of Islam by showing these cartoons. So far from being a guarantor of free speech in schools, it actually can be invoked to undermine it. So I think the government should do that, and no doubt we'll be stepping up that campaign. Where should the limit be when it comes to stirring up violence? Good question. One of my issues with the 1965 Race Relations Act is that it substituted the breach of the peace principle, which was you could only be arrested if your speech act was likely to stir up disorder. It replaced that with the likelihood of what you're saying stirring up racial hatred, i.e. an emotion rather than a physical event. And that's one of the ways in which I think our free speech has been eroded. So if we could get back to talking about whether speech is likely to stir up violence rather than emotions we regard as undesirable, but only when applied to certain people, that would be a huge step forward. How much free speech should be allowed on social media? I think that it's not that the state should impose certain content moderation policies on social media platforms like X and Facebook. Those platforms should just make it easier for people to create the settings they feel safest with. So if there's a certain level of harassment, a certain kind of level of free speech which is a little bit too wild and raw that you don't want, you could just be able to adjust the safety settings on the social media platform to protect yourself from it without actually imposing that level of safety on everyone else. Can private companies be forced to uphold free speech? That was sort of the gist of your question. Isn't that a breach of the principle of freedom of association? I think broadly speaking, I agree with that hesitation. But I think when it comes to social media companies, because they have become the town square, we ought to be less inhibited about forcing them to observe free speech.
Thank you very much, Toby. Thomas.
So I'll start on John Stuart Mill. I don't hate him. I think he was genuinely well-intentioned truth seeker who was trying to defend liberty, but he made a key error, and there's a lesson in that, which is that he recognized that truth isn't based on one person's opinion, so he tried to broaden it, and I think he made a mistake. He broadened it to society instead of to human beings at large or human beings as such. And that goes to the point that it's so important to get the fundamental underpinnings of an argument right. If you get those foundations wrong, the whole thing comes crashing down. Same with basing the Declaration of Independence and those rights in the Constitution on God, as the man at the back said. If you haven't got a solid foundation, it doesn't stand. It's really important to get those fundamentals. That goes right into what the excellent contribution from the woman about education. Education is the most important issue in our society. It literally underlies every single other social issue we have. Poverty, all that stuff, all goes back to education. It's the values we taught at school. That's why what Toby did 13 years ago, setting up a free school to teach people thinking clearly, properly, is so valuable. It's one of the most important things you can do is teach, and that's part of why I do the work I do as well. The other woman's question about incitement to violence, I don't think that's the best label for that. I think credible threat of violence is a better label. The reason that that's wrong, that it's wrong to threaten force, is because you reduce a person or limit a person's ability to act on their own judgment, on their own mind. If you say, take 1960s lynchings in America, if you say if a black man walks outside, we're going to hang him, he can't. You've threatened him out of doing that. You've restricted his freedom. On the other hand, if you say that Hamas is a terrorist organization and a bunch of Hamas people start rioting, that's their fault. So, you have to be presenting a credible threat to somebody else's freedom. It doesn't. An incitement makes it sound like if you just annoy someone else and then they commit violence, that's your fault. And that's not reasonable. The credible part's really important. The very last thing I'll say is I don't think a private company can censor. I think censorship is when you use force against someone. If you want to post on Twitter and they take your post down, don't post on Twitter. You don't have a right to their platform. But if the government comes around and imprisons you, that's a use of force. So you can always just leave Facebook, Twitter, whatever if you want to. You can't leave the government. You can't run away from that. So it's only censorship when force is involved.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Tom.
Yes, so very quickly, the question about incitement, it's one of those things which, this is where you really get down to brass tacks, but I do believe that, broadly speaking, what we might call the Brandenburg standard, that speech has to be both likely and intended to cause imminent lawless action, is the right one, because of the fact that it provides for the fact that people can express opinions, even to advocate for violence. But the point is we trust in individuals not to mindlessly act on that. We make a clear distinction between people who are advocating for something and people who are actually doing it. And I think it also speaks to the fact that anything which is still basically the expression of opinion isn't something that we should criminalise, because that is the basis on which all of the other protections are. It means that you can have people saying completely ugly things, but at the same time, I think it's important that we hold that line, but also take on the bigotry which was being expressed and was exposed by that post-riots period. I've got to say there was a lot of people in the kind of right-wing commentariat who are making a lot of excuses for those scumbags, and I think it's just a reminder that we need to take those arguments on anew, even if it is a fringe. On the question of social media and should we regulate them in order to create more freedom of speech, it's a similar kind of problem, which is if we had a government in the US or a government in the UK try to regulate social media companies, it would be something like the Online Safety Act. It would be trying to regulate them to be more censorious. At the same time, the idea that in principle it's horrendous and wrong to say that companies can't do certain things, I think is ridiculous. There's all kinds of things we don't let companies do. We don't let them discriminate against people on the basis of race. And I think if we're teary-eyed about the property rights of billionaires rather than the speech rights of the masses, our moral compass is completely screwed up. Just finally, there's been this kind of question about the culture and the law, and it's important to change the culture so we can change the law. I also think it's important to change the culture so that we can change the culture. Because I think a lot of people here, if they could think about certain views that they're afraid of expressing, it's probably not because they're worried they're going to get a visit by the police. It's because they might get a visit from an Islamist who might attack them. Or it's because they're going to get a visit from a trans activist who is going to have no compunction about punching a middle-aged woman in the face because they've decided that they're a fascist. This is the thing about freedom of speech, is it isn't just limited to our legal rights. It's also the question of, are we afraid to express ourselves because of the consequences meted out by extreme individuals? Are we afraid about expressing ourselves because of the sword of Damocles of cancellation and ostracism and so on? So, as I say, changing the culture I think is important from a legal perspective, but it's also important just for changing the culture. Let's do that.
Thank you very much, John. Nico, your turn. I just take this chance to say thank you for suggesting this debate.
Yes, of course.
Really very helpful.
Yes, of course. And let's see if I can turn this audience against me right here at the end. In response to the Brandenburg standard, that is the standard for incitement in the United States. One of FIRE's first cases came in the wake of 9/11, of course, when the airplanes were flown into the towers as well as into the Pentagon. We defended the right of a professor to say that anyone who blows up the Pentagon has my vote. Not a very sensitive thing to say, right after over 3,000 people lost their lives in a terrorist attack. But it was the principle that we stood for, that someone has the right to contribute to the public debate around issues of public concern, even if they do so in caustic and offensive ways. I'm going to try and turn you against me even more here. The calls for Jewish genocide that the presidents of the 3 universities were asked about in Congress before 2 of them subsequently resigned in the wake of that. When they responded to Elise Stefanik and said that context matters, they were right. Context always matters in the context of unprotected speech. If you have someone following a Jewish student from their class to their dorm room chanting Intifada and from the river to the sea, that very well could be targeted discriminatory harassment prohibited, unprotected by the First Amendment. But amorphous calls for genocide, that is going to be a prohibition that is going to be wielded by political opponents against one another. We have to remember that in the early days of the war, the calls for Jewish genocide were being well, you had Jewish people saying that the events on October 7th were, and the people supporting them were calling for genocide. Now you have people saying that those supporting Israel's war are calling for genocide. So you have people saying the other side is calling for genocide on both sides of that debate. You have pro-life activists saying that those who advocate for abortion are committing a genocide against the unborn. You have those who are critical of gender-affirming care saying, being told by trans rights activists that they're committing a genocide against trans people. So you can just see how an amorphous ban on calls for genocide is just going to be wielded by different political sides to go after their political opponents. So I would say it needs to be very careful, and I think the Brandenburg Standard has done that. It needs to be targeted, it needs to be likely, and it needs to be imminent. Otherwise, it's going to be a political weapon. A few last comments here to turn you all against me some more. Speech rights of billionaires versus the masses. Billionaires have free speech rights too, because I ground my free speech principles in natural rights. So just because you have billions of dollars does not mean you give up your rights, including your property rights. And then to the gentleman's question up here about free speech culture in the United States, you're absolutely right. Americans will say they support freedom of speech, and then they'll often append a but to that. And Salman Rushdie calls these folks buttheads. We have too many buttheads in America when surrounding the misinformation debate, which I think is kind of like the hate speech debate of old. You have, I think, something like 58% of Americans today who say that the government should restrict misinformation online. And this is up from 38% in 2018. But then if you dig down deeper into that and you ask them what their biggest cause for concern, who are the biggest purveyors of misinformation are, they will tell you that it's the politicians. So I don't know who they think is going to restrict misinformation online, but certainly they do have their concerns about politicians, so debate in America can be at least schizophrenic, but we do have a broader kind of appeal to free speech that's on both sides or all sides of the political spectrum in America that is helpful in the debate and I think that is somewhat lacking here. Nobody wants to say they're against freedom of speech in the United States, for example. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I was worried that as the last debate of the day that it might lack energy. It was actually excellent. And the contributions from the floor were as excellent as the contributions from the front. But that was a cracking way to finish things. Now let's go and have a drink. But can we give a final last thank you to our panelists?